Once again, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Aaron Rosenblum. I'm the Health and Science Librarian at the Portland Public Library. I'll be monitoring the event tonight with my colleague Sarah. And if you need to communicate anything to us, you could find me in the chat. You can see that my username here tonight is PPL Zoom. And you can also use the chat just to the whole room or to me if you have questions for our speaker. If you want to drop those in even just throughout the program, and we'll kind of collect them up, and we'll get to the Q&A at the end that way. Tonight's event is part of our sustainability series, which we are thrilled to host with our partners at the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. This is our 5th season collaborating on the sustainability series. Our next event after tonight is on February 24th at 5:30 p.m. And again, we'll be on Zoom. And that event will be with Portland Water District for Water World, Natural and Built Infrastructure for Treating and Managing Water. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Burton, the Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative and our partner in the series, to introduce the program this evening on preserving land and history on Little Diamond Island. Jessica.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited for this talk. The Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative is a network of land and water conservation organizations that's committed to working together to have greater impact on our place, on our land and water. And we are drawn to this topic as conservationists because we're connected to our places so deeply. We know that place is an essential element in a healthy future. But how much do we know about what happened in this place? Who remembers? Without stepping into and fully understanding our past, we cannot know who we are or where we're going. Without repairing, we cannot all move forward together. And I think about the inaugural poet, Amanda Gorman, and her beautiful poem, The Hill We Climb. And in that, she sort of, what I heard, presented us with a challenge. And really to be brave and see and be the light, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. What's the past we step into and how we repair it. So again, as conservationists, we're really committed to this place, and we're really committed to uncovering of this place. And I am so excited to introduce Harry Pringle. Harry is a retired attorney who for many years was the managing partner of the law firm Drummond Woodsum in Portland. He also served for a number of years on the board of Oceanside Conservation Trust and has long been active in land conservation efforts on Little Diamond Island. When the opportunity to preserve lots, which were once the site of Bishop Healy's cottage, presented itself, Harry became interested in the history of the cottage and in trying to investigate the rumors about its destruction. And so we're thrilled to have Harry. I worked with Harry when he was on the board of Oceanside Conservation Trust. They are one of our members, and it was really great. I'm really glad I had that opportunity and was able to work with him tonight to have him here to present to all of you. So thank you, Harry, for taking the time to do this. I'm really excited to hear your talk, and thank you all. So without any further ado, I will hand the mic to you.
Okay, Jess, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can all see an image of Little Diamond Island. As Jess said, I'm not a historian. I'm just a retired lawyer. That means I can read and write reasonably well, but I've got no historical research skills whatsoever. So take that into account as you listen to me. I've tried to get this story right, and hopefully I have, but if I've gone awry someplace, or if you have something you can correct, I have absolutely no pride. I won't be offended in the least, so please correct me whenever I need correcting. Last year, Little Diamond Island raised the funds to buy 2 really important waterfront lots on the island, 2 of the last undeveloped lots, and transfer them to Oceanside Conservation Trust. when Oceanside acquires a piece of land, it has to do a management plan, which includes the historical features behind the land. So I'm just going to orient you before I go any further. This is Little Diamond Island. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, you're looking at the west end. That's the end that faces Portland. Here is the casino. And then over here, you can just see the edge of what used to be the Rand property, the Coast Guard station. Before that, the U.S. Lighthouse Service Station. And over here, it's high tide in this photo, but here is the sandbar to Great Diamond Island. The lots that we're talking about are located right here. If you can see my cursor, that's the upper lot. And the lower lot, there are two lots actually, is right over here. The upper lot, if you look at it from the water, this is in the channel between Little Diamond and Peaks. It's an extraordinary piece of land. It sits high. Picture again was taken at a high tide, but there's a good 20 to 30 foot cliff there. And this is the land we're talking about. Here's a view of the interior of that lot, which is now covered with mature beech trees, a lot of younger beech trees coming along. And to look at that lot, you would think that it's been forest forever, but in fact, right over here, if you can see my cursor, was the site of a cottage that was owned by the Catholic Bishop of Portland for many years. And that cottage burned down at some point. We knew that when we raised the funds on the island to buy the lot and give the lots to Oceanside. We didn't know much about the history of that cottage, or at least I didn't. But the rumor on the island had always been that the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, burned that cottage down. So I volunteered, perhaps stupidly, to try and look a little bit at that history so that we could put it into the management plan and actually have a baseline to understand the history of that lot. I started by talking to islanders. A lot of islanders knew about the rumor, started asking, well, why does anybody think the KKK burned it down? Nobody was really too sure about that. So I started on this journey, which has taken me the better part of a year. And a lot of folks helped me along the way. So I'm just going to mention them to get that out of the way because I'll forget otherwise. But Barbara Miles, who's the archivist for the Catholic Diocese, was incredibly helpful. Abraham Schechter, who's with the Portland Public Library's Portland Room, found the only written account that I know of the burning of the cottage. Herb Adams, who many of you know is a prominent local historian, will help me a great deal. Tom Riley, who's a retired professor of anthropology and a descendant of Bishop Healy's sister. So very familiar with the story of the family, was nice enough to talk to me for almost an hour on the phone. And then finally, Phil Lee, who's a fellow Little Diamond Islander. Phil just knows an awful lot about Little Diamond and sort of pointed me in the right direction at various times. So here's our story. It starts in 1818 when a young man by the name of Michael Healy emigrates to the United States from Ireland. We're not sure if he came directly to the United States. Family lore has it that he actually went to Canada to fight on the side of the British in the War of 1812, and then decided, as the British put it, to take French leave, or as the Americans would put it, to go AWOL and leave for the United States instead. But we know that about 1818, early 1819, he's made his way to central Georgia. And Georgia then, especially the central part of it, was the frontier, literally the frontier. And Georgia was very, very busy trying to lure white settlers to the central part of the state and to give them land. And the way that they did this was through a land lottery. And this is a etching actually that comes from the New Georgia Encyclopedia. The way the land lottery worked was that if you were a white citizen and had been a resident of Georgia for 2 years, and you were a male, you could enter the lottery. A slip with your name was put in one drum. The lands had been surveyed, and so the description of lots was in the other drum. And if your name was pulled along with a lot, it was yours. And the thing that we need to understand about the land lottery is that the lottery wasn't just distributing vacant land, it was actually distributing land that was largely owned by the Creek and the Cherokee Indian nations. So this was a very deliberate way of getting Indian land into the hands of white settlers. If you're interested in this process, there's a pretty amazing book called The Unworthy Republic. It just came out this year, which is about the dispossession, which is a nice way to put it, of the Creek and the Cherokee Indian nations of their lands and the way that they were forced to Oklahoma. It's a pretty amazing story, but it's part of our heritage, unfortunately. In any event, our young Michael Healy does pretty well in this land lottery, and he ultimately acquires over the course of his lifetime about 1,500 acres of land. It's near the city of Macon. The land is absolutely perfect for growing cotton, but in order to clear it, he had to buy slaves. And so he bought a bunch of slaves. One of the first slaves that he bought was a young lady, a teenager, whose name was Mary Eliza. She was age 16. She was actually mixed race. We think she was probably the daughter of the owner of a nearby plantation and one of his mixed race slaves. But in any event, Mary, within a year, had born Michael Healy, his first son. And over the next 15 years of her life or so, a little bit longer, she bore him a total of 10 children. The first son was named James, and he was born in 1830. So to sort of put some context into this, interracial marriage was illegal in Georgia in 1830 and for many, many years thereafter. So Michael could not marry his slave, Mary. He did treat her as his common law wife, and in his will, in fact, you can read the section where he acknowledged that she was the mother of all of his children, and he in fact provided a pension for her, but he could not marry her. And to make matters worse, in Georgia, by Georgia law, children took the status of their mother, not their father, which was actually quite convenient for white male owners of plantations. And so Michael's children by Mary were also Michael's slaves. Slaves could not be freed under Georgia law. It took a special act of the legislature to free a slave, and there are reasons for that, which we can go into if people have questions. And it was virtually impossible to get the legislature to approve that kind of an act. So Michael's children were slaves. He couldn't free them. He could not free his wife. And to make matters worse, it was also illegal to teach slaves to read and write or to give them any schooling. And so over time, first James and then all of his siblings were sent north to go to school so they could get an education. And James was sent to a Quaker school in New York and then to a school in New Jersey. He was probably 7 or so years old when he was sent north. These were boarding schools and he boarded with families. But if you think about that for a minute, here's a 7-year-old kid being taken from a plantation in Georgia, sent to New York, New Jersey. He would never see his mother again for the rest of his life. And Mary Eliza never saw any of her children, so far as we can tell, for the rest of her life either. All of her children ultimately went north. you can just imagine what that means to a 7-year-old kid. But turns out that James was a brilliant student. He entered what was then the brand new Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts at the age of 14. And he was number one in his graduating class. When he graduated in 1849, he was the valedictorian of that class. Holy Cross was run, of course, by the Jesuits. And so it's not surprising, given his background and given how much time he had spent associated with the Catholic Church, that he decided that he wanted to be a priest. He could not study at the Jesuit seminar in Maryland because Maryland was a slave state and he was subject to being arrested if he crossed the Mason-Dixon line. So instead, he went first to a seminary in Montreal and then to a seminary in Paris, where he was ordained actually at Notre Dame Cathedral in 1854. He was by then fluent in French, which would become a really important asset for him later in life. But by then, as well, first Mary and then Michael had both died. And there is the tombstone in Georgia for Michael and Mary Eliza. It's probably fortunate, you can tell from the tombstone, that Mary Eliza died first. They died just several months apart in 1850. And that is because if Eliza had died first as a slave, she couldn't be set free under Michael's will. And she might well have been sold as part of his estate when the estate was liquidated. But she predeceased him. And the Healy children, who by now were almost all, within a year or so, were now all in the North, inherited the estate. It was ultimately liquidated within a few years after the death of the Healys for about $50,000. If you go to various internet sites and try and figure out what $1 at 1850 is worth now, you'll come up with about $1.5 to $1.6 million. And the most valuable part of the estate when it was sold was not the land, 1,500 acres of prime cotton land, or the personal effects, which had been acquired over 25 years by a very wealthy, by then, cotton planter, but the slaves themselves. They brought a good part of that $1.5 million. So the terrible, terrible irony of this part of the story is that it was the sale of slaves that made the children of a slave financially secure for the rest of their lives. And in fact, the Healy family, and the Healy family itself is an extraordinary family. We're talking about Bishop Healy here, but he had a brother who was the president of Georgetown University, another brother who was the first Black man to command a United States naval vessel, sisters who rose as far as you could possibly rise in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. It was an amazing family. But if you want to know, actually, this is sort of interesting. If you want to know what happened to the Healy plantation, it is now called Healy Point Golf Club, just outside of Macon, Georgia. And that is a picture taken from the Macon website, City of Macon website of the clubhouse. So from Creek Indian land to cotton plantation to golf course, all in the course of just about 150 years. So to pick up our story, James, meanwhile, had returned from Paris, becomes a priest in Boston, and because he's an extraordinarily capable young man, he rises very quickly through the Catholic hierarchy, and he's ordained as the second Catholic Bishop of Portland in 1875. That's a portrait of Bishop Healy, courtesy of the Catholic Diocese. He's often referred to now as the first Black Catholic bishop in the United States. It's not at all clear to me that he would have described himself that way, because as Mr. O'Toole describes in his another extraordinary book, Passing for White, which is actually the history of the Healy family, in order to succeed in white society in the second half of the 1800s, even in the North, the Healy siblings effectively had to renounce their Black heritage and pass themselves off as white. So I suspect that Bishop Healy thought of himself as an Irish Catholic, not as the son of a Black slave mother in Georgia. The last quarter of the 1800s turns out to have been a period of amazing growth in the Catholic Church and for immigration in Maine. There were Irish Catholics coming over after the famine from Ireland, settling in all over the state, Munjoy Hill in particular in Portland. A lot of French Canadians, Catholics, that were coming south to work in the mills. So if you think about it, Bishop Healy was a perfect person to be the bishop and be in charge of a diocese of French-speaking Canadians and English-speaking Irishmen. And over the next 25 years, he presided over an incredible amount of growth in the Catholic diocese. I've got to always look at my notes to be sure I get this right, but during his 25-year tenure, he built a total of 60, that's 60 churches, 18 convents, and 18 parochial schools. It's pretty extraordinary. I have no doubt that he was a wonderful bishop and mentor to all of his parishioners, but I have to wonder if he also didn't have quite a lot of skills as a real estate developer, because that's a lot of building over the course of a short period of time. So it's now 1875 in our little story. And at this point, our story turns to Little Diamond Island, because Little Diamond Island, and I'll explain this map in just a second, in 1875 was owned by the Deering family, Deering Oaks, Deering Avenue, and they'd owned it for well over 100 years. It was used largely for tenant farming and for some fish drying. But they were getting a little sick and tired of owning this tiny island. And so in 1875, they sold 4 acres to the United States Lighthouse Service to use as a maintenance facility and depot. And if I can enlarge this map effectively, which gets a little tricky here, I'll show you what is going on here, because this, forget the rest of the map. This is a map of Little Diamond itself. And the 4 acres that were sold to the United States government, to the Lighthouse Service, are right here. In 1882, or 1880, excuse me, the Deering heirs decided that they wanted to get rid of the entire island. And so they had it surveyed, and they actually divided it in half right along this line. And if you go to Little Diamond today and walk this line, there's actually a fence along a good part of it. The front side of the island, the east side here, they sold to a Portland lady by the name of Elizabeth Smith. And she began building a row of rental cottages, which on this is a 1914 map, by the way, so 40 years or so after this all took place. But those cottages are right along here on City View Avenue, and a lot of those cottages still exist. She sold the other half of the island, the west half of the island, to guess who? Bishop Healy, who was acquiring land for various purposes. And Bishop Healy decided on his half of the island to build 3 structures. 2 of those structures he built for the Sisters of Mercy, and they're right here. The Sisters of Mercy operated an orphanage in Portland, and these buildings were designed as a summer orphanage and retreat for the sisters. And over here, on the very highest part of the west side of the island, he built a cottage for himself and for for the bishop, not for himself, but for the bishop. And when it was built, I think it was described as being by far the nicest, biggest cottage on the island. This is a picture of the Sisters of the Summer Convent orphanage. This building here, this is taken from the 1924 Portland tax photos. This building here is the building that the nuns themselves slept in. The building next to it is the building that housed the orphans, was later a summer camp. And if you walked down the road in front of these two structures today, you would recognize them immediately. They're still standing. They look very much the same. There've been some changes to the outside, but by and large, they are just as they were. By contrast, it's been almost impossible to find, in fact, impossible to find a good picture of the bishop's cottage. And I've spent a lot of time trying, and other people have tried to help. This is a photograph that actually comes from the National Archive. No, this one is actually from the Catholic Diocese. It's the only picture that the Catholic Diocesan Archives have that shows the cottage at all. And to orient you, here is the lighthouse station that we've seen before. Here is a lookout tower, which actually was a wooden tower that was the old wooden bug light before bug light was replaced by a cast iron structure at some point in the 1870s. And right here, if you look closely, you can see a big roof. And that is the roof of Bishop Healy's cottage. It would have had a commanding view over Peaks Island over here to the right, Long Island, all the way past House Island, probably all the way to South Portland. So that's the only photograph that the diocese has or could find. Here is another photograph, this one from the National Archives, taken at a different time, I think a little earlier. You can see a windmill here, presumably for water. And right here, if you look closely, you can see the outline of the roof of the bishop's cottage. And you can see how it would have been sited. These trees were here along the top of the bank, but there were very few trees actually behind the cottage itself or around the cottage. Here is another picture, this one courtesy of Phil Lee on Little Diamond Island, which is taken showing the lighthouse station, I'm guessing about 1915, if I had to guess. Here again, just to orient ourselves, is the wooden tower. Right here is the bishop's cottage, very close to it. Behind it, you can see various roofs, which appear to be very close to the bishop's cottage. In fact, they're on the other side of the island, and that's just a foreshortening caused by the early telephoto lens that was used. Here you can see that the bishop would have had a very nice view down over the lawn, right straight looking at Peaks Island. And that cottage there's actually one more photograph that I was able to find, this also from the National Archives. Again, here's our tower, and here is the bishop's cottage itself. It's a little hard because none of these photographs are dated, so you have to guess by the vegetation which might have been the oldest and which the youngest. That cottage becomes the center of Catholic summer socializing in Portland in the 1880s and 90s. The bishop threw a huge annual bishop's picnic for all of his parishioners. There were hundreds, and some accounts say thousands of people that would come to the island every August. There were clam bakes near the sandbar. There were baseball games, games for the kids, fiddlers playing Irish jigs. And a lot of people have said that during that part of the late 1800s, early 1900s, Little Diamond was referred to as the Catholic island, and it's not surprising. The diocese owned almost exactly half of it. Bishop Healy dies in 1900. And if you go to Calvary Cemetery, which I did about 10 days ago, right after the snow melted, there is the Celtic cross that marks his grave. It's a beautiful place, and it's a shame that it doesn't look out over Casco Bay, because the bishop loved Casco Bay and loved Little Diamond Island. He spent as much time there as he possibly could, according to his biography. After Bishop Healy's death, the bishops who succeed him use the cottage less and less frequently. World War I comes and goes. The Spanish flu pandemic comes and goes. And at some point, the bishops' picnics cease entirely. The sisters continue to use their summer orphanage. And in fact, it's used as a summer camp well up into the 1980s. But then in November of 1923, the bishop's cottage burns to the ground. And as I said earlier, the rumor on the island has always been that it was burned by the KKK. So what do we make of that rumor? Well, as it turns out, it's a sad part of Maine's history, but in the early 1920s, the KKK was resurgent in the state of Maine. And it reached the very height of its powers somewhere between 1923 and 1925. And since there were so few Blacks in Maine, the KKK focused its vitriol on Catholics, and particularly the French Canadian immigrants who were coming down to work in the mills, and Jews. And its platform in large part was to ensure that white Protestants controlled the politics of the state, the city, and their municipalities. The King Kleagle, chief recruiter of Maine in the early 1920s, was a gentleman by the name of Eugene Farnsworth. He was very, very charismatic. He had an interesting background. He was a former stage magician and was very used to performing in front of large crowds. And he embarked on a number of statewide speaking tours. He held rallies that attracted literally thousands of people. You could join the Klan at the end of any one of those rallies by paying a $10 membership fee. And Mr. Farnsworth got a part of that $10. So he had an incentive beyond his own political beliefs for increasing membership in the Klan. What you're seeing here, this is from the Maine Historical Society, is a parade, a procession in 1923. It's not dated, but I'm guessing it's the fall of 1923. What you're seeing here is a picture of a statewide field day. This was actually in 1926, courtesy of the Maine Historical Society. You'll recognize this picture if you actually look at it closely, because what you're looking at is Hadlock Field. And over here in the corner, it's very indistinct. You're looking at the corner of the Portland Expo. That's a lot of Klansmen gathered in Portland, Maine. Here is a photograph, this one courtesy actually of the Island Falls Historical Society, of a parade that took place in Milo, but note the date. The cottage burns in November of 1923. This is supposedly the first parade in the Northeast states of the Ku Klux Klan, the first daylight parade of the Klan in the entire United States, September 3rd, 1923. And here, another picture. This is from the Library of Congress, photograph dated October 12. Pay attention to these dates. This is October 12, 1923. This also is in Portland. I'm not sure what the location is. It may be Deering Oaks. It's obviously a large open parcel of land that is wooded. And also in 1923, the Klan buys a large estate in Portland. And the purpose of this estate is to serve as its main headquarters and clubhouse. This is a picture from the 1924 Portland tax records. And this was the house that was on the Rollins estate, which the KKK bought. When I first saw this picture, I thought the KKK was actually a sign on the side of this old elm tree. It isn't. It's actually was added there by the city of Portland to identify this as the clubhouse. It was a beautiful clubhouse. And according to the newspaper reports at the time, a total of 3,000 Klansmen gathered for the opening celebration of the headquarters in 1923. Here, coming up, is another view of that same house with a very large structure to the left. I'm not sure what that is. The KKK had a large auditorium. I don't know if that's what that is. Somebody who is listening may well know. But that is the KKK headquarters, opened to great fanfare in 1923. A lot of other stuff was going on in Portland with the KKK in 1923 as well. It was at about that time that the Portland adopted a referendum that went to a city manager form of government. The KKK supported that, believing that that was the only way to reduce the influence of Catholics and Jews on Portland city government. If you're interested, by the way, where 509 Forest Avenue is today, that's courtesy of Google Maps. So from the Rollins estate in the 1920s to a furniture store in 2021. The rise of the Klan also split the Republican Party pretty much down the middle in Maine. The old guard, including Governor Baxter, detested the Klan and detested what it stood for. But the Klan announced, Eugene Farnsworth announced, that it was powerful enough politically that it would elect the next governor of the state of Maine. It supported Owen Brewster for governor, and sure enough, in 1924, Governor Brewster was elected. He later became a senator from the state of Maine. Governor Brewster never acknowledged being a Klan member, but he accepted the Klan's support, and the Klan made sure that everybody knew that the Klan was the reason he was elected. And the Klan was active in a lot of local elections across the state as well. By 1926, the tide is turning. Politicians and the public are turning away from the Klan. Mr. Farnsworth dies of cancer in 1926 as well, and the Klan sort of fades away in Maine politics. Some commentators have said that was due in large part to the tremendous amount of violence that the Klan perpetrated in the South. It was less violent in Maine, apparently, but that turned off a lot of voters. The recession was also coming over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, and people weren't as interested in paying that membership fee as they had been. So what do we make of this rumor that the Klan burned down the cottage? Thanks to the Portland Room, we were able to locate the only written description of the destruction of the cottage, at least that I've seen. As you can see, it's entitled Blaze at Little Diamond, Threatens Destruction of Nearby Structures. And it's an account of how the fire was discovered and dealt with by the firefighters. So if you think about the history of the Klan, what we know is that the Klan was at the absolute height of its influence in Maine and in Portland in the fall of 1923. We know that the cottage burns on November 20 of 1923. So what else do we know about that date or about that cottage fire? Well, for starters, we know that the Bishop's Cottage was not the only Catholic building to burn mysteriously in Portland in 1923. Herb Adams and the Portland Fire Department historian discovered that on January 12th, 1923, a building at 107 Franklin Street, now Franklin Arterial, burned as well. cause unknown. That's two major fires of property owned by the Catholic Diocese in 1 year. We know that on November 20th, 1923, it was pretty damn cold. I know that by checking with the Weather Service records, because the low temperature that night was 22 degrees, the high was 43, and we know that the cottage fire was discovered in mid-morning. So mid-morning, it probably would have been in the mid-30s. We think that pretty sure that the cottage was not insulated. Almost no cottages on the island are, or in fact were, or even still are. There's only one account that I was able to find of anybody staying in the cottage, and that's actually in a book which is the history of the Sisters of Mercy, called For Love of Mercy, which is a fascinating book. If you have a week or so to work your way through it, you'll learn a lot about the history of the Sisters of Mercy. But the sisters had a key to the cottage. And on one occasion, and only one occasion that the book recalls, two sisters couldn't get off the island, couldn't catch the ferry, stayed in the cottage. It was described as a nice, beautiful, crisp autumn day. But what they discovered when they slept over in the cottage was that there were no blankets in the cottage at all. It was clearly a summer cottage, and the suggestion I submit is that it was rarely used by the diocese on a cold, cold day in November. The Evening Express article tells us that the fire broke out shortly before noon, but although it details all of the firefighters who came over from Portland and the men who helped fight the fire from the lighthouse station, there's no mention whatsoever of any occupants. There's no mention of anybody who was helping them fight the fire. The Evening Express article also tells us that the fire spread so quickly that by the time it was discovered, there was no way to save the cottage, and the firefighters really spent all their time trying to save the nearby orphanage buildings that we saw earlier. And they were worried that the fire would spread to the woods because the woods were bone dry. There'd been very little rain in the summer of 1923. There's no evidence that the fire was smoldering for any lengthy period of time. It seems to have been a fairly quick event. And then finally, there in fact have been very few fires on Little Diamond over the years. Maybe 3 is all I know of. Longtime islanders may have known of others. But anyone who lives on an island knows that unoccupied cottages rarely just up and decide to burn on their own. So who knows? Maybe it's just an island legend. Maybe the KKK burned it down. Maybe there were some kids playing with matches, but I checked, and November 20th was a weekday. Kids probably would have been in school. As Herb Adams put it, in thinking about this, he'd heard the rumor too. And what his comment was, well, you know, Harry, legends rarely grow in the dark. So my guess, and this is just me, but my guess is that someone burned that cottage intentionally. Somebody listening or somebody who talks to somebody who's listening may know more about it. Maybe back somebody's great-great-great-grandfather was one of the firefighters or was working on the Coast Guard station and helped put out that fire. If anybody knows about it, I'd love to hear. But either way, I think you've got to agree with me that the story of Bishop Healy's cottage is pretty darn interesting. It's a story really, I think, of 100 years of American history. And to think that it all centers on one very small lot on one tiny island off of Portland. And that's it, except for a postscript, again, courtesy of Herb Adams. He says there's actually a parallel legend to this one, which is that, remember the KKK headquarters on Forest Ave? There was a major fire there a couple of years later. I think it may have been the auditorium. I'm not entirely sure. Herb would know. But the legend goes that when that fire started and the alarm went into the Portland Fire Department, The Portland Fire Department was very, very slow to respond to the fire. And the Portland Fire Department then was comprised, as I'm sure you know, largely of Irish Catholics, suggesting that maybe there is some little bit of justice in this world after all. So that's it. That's the story of Bishop Healy's Cottage, 100 years of American history, all on one tiny little lot on Little Diamond Island.
Harry, thank you. That was really such a comprehensive study that, yes, started with that one little place on the island. So many connections to so much, and the detail of what you have researched and found through connection, through just your time and interest is really, that was really fascinating. And I am seeing the chat, so I'm not sure if I'm seeing all the questions, but I do see one question that has come in. And that is, what plans, and Harry, because you're not on the board anymore of Oceanside Conservation Trust, you might not know the answer to this question, but perhaps you do. What plans does Oceanside Conservation Trust have for the property?
Well, it's Oceanside's mission is to preserve and protect the property. So there's a conservation easement that will be put on it, and it'll be preserved in perpetuity. So it'll be open to all of us to enjoy. And as I said, it's an absolutely beautiful piece of land. I'd love to get to the bottom of this mystery if it's possible, and maybe somewhere in the diocesan archives or somewhere in the Portland room, neither of which I've been able to access given the pandemic. Maybe there's more to be found out. Phil Lee was walking around the lot with me and discovered, just by poking around in the leaves, the outfall that went from the sewage system to right out, actually over the edge of the cliff. It must have been a beautiful sight when somebody flushed that toilet. So we know pretty well where the cottage was. And at one point, when our neighbor's daughter got herself a metal detector, I thought maybe we should go on ahead and do a little digging. But the more I think about it, and my recommendation to the board would be, if that subject comes up, that be done professionally. I would like to see also a plaque that actually tells the story, because it's an amazing story of an amazing family and an amazing century, really, of American history. But you'll have to ask the board. I'm no longer on the board. I can just tell the board what I think they should do, which is actually kind of refreshing.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have some board members in the audience, so you just told them. So that's good. So we have some more questions, which is great. Keep them coming. Do you know, was there any violence beyond arson that the KKK perpetuated in Maine? Do you know sort of broadly about that?
You know, I've done a lot of reading about the KKK. There's much more I could do. Cross burnings, clearly, intimidation. I'm not aware of any of the kind of horrifically violent lynchings that happened in the South. And as I said earlier, some commentators have said that news of those lynchings was one reason for the demise, not the demise, but the reduction in membership of the KKK in Maine. My sense from my reading is that it was politically active, very driven by its white, Protestant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-immigrant philosophy, and determined to advance that. But I haven't seen a lot of accounts of violence. Having said that, I would not want to have a burning cross on my property. I'm not saying that isn't pretty awful thing.
Yeah, that's violence for sure, I would say. So I have a question. Did you do a lot of this research during the pandemic? Have you been doing this sort of just by phone call and what you can find online?
You can find an awful lot of stuff online. when I mentioned I talked to Tom Riley, that's an interesting story because Tom is actually a descendant of one of Bishop Healy's sisters. And he's an amazing guy. Obviously, spent a lot of time trying to track down the history of his family. And so some in-person discussions, but a lot of internet research and help from archivists of one sort or another.
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the questions was about the research and wondering if there were any police reports or investigations on the source of the fire. Did they ever put any time into that?
Yeah, I mean, what I need to do, if I can ever find the time and safe way to do it, is to actually start looking at all of the newspaper articles for the entire year of 1923, because there may well be some other accounts that nobody knows about. This is the only one I've been able to find. So I'm not saying there isn't something else out there. There may be some police reports. The article ends with the cryptic cause of fire undetermined. And I'm not sure it ever was determined. I'm not sure there would have been a whole lot of interest in determining it necessarily, which is a whole other issue. But
yeah, right. And a couple questions just about the foundation. Is there any foundation remaining on the site?
If you walk around it, you won't see any foundation at all. You'll see the remains of what once was an iron water tank, probably a water heater. That's literally it, which is not surprising. It's on ledge. It would have probably been built on stilts. And there's also there's 100 years of leaf litter, and nobody has done any digging. As I said earlier, I think if there's going to be digging done, it really ought to be done professionally, given the importance of the site. Short answer, no.
Harry, there's a question here also about when did folks become aware that Maine had the first Black bishop? And I'll tag on to that person's question. Sort of just when the conception of Bishop Healy started to change, because it's, related.
Well, let me take a crack at that. First of all, I think it was known when he was bishop. It was, one biographer described it as an open secret, certainly known within the church. And I think one of the reasons that the bishop was able to be as successful as he was because he was part of this amazing family, which was the Catholic Church, and accepted his brother as well, who was a priest in Boston, and who was even darker complexion. But at some point in the 1950s, there was a biography written of him, which I've read online. I don't remember the exact name of it. And it was written by a Catholic cleric who was very interested, as the civil rights movement was getting started, in the role that Blacks had played in the church. And he was, I think, the person who really first brought to modern consciousness the fact that Bishop Healy was the first bishop of Black descent in the United States.
His having gone to the seminary in Montreal, and that connection with Franco-Americans and French Canadians is really interesting too, because for anyone who's lived or spent much time in Quebec and thinking about the relationships there between the English and the French, the parallels to race in America are really alarming, and it's kind of highlighted by the KKK, and that wasn't anyone's question. Sorry. There are more questions.
We'll take that as a good comment.
Right. There is a question about whether the Sisters of Mercy still own the residence and the orphanage building. Actually, two questions about, what will happen to the orphanage buildings if they're there?
No, they do not. In the 1880s, the Sisters of Mercy, I think, encountered some financial difficulties, or at least were encouraged by their financial advisor to sell their half of the island. And it was subdivided and sold. The buildings which were the old orphanage are now owned by a private family, used as a private residence, and are being restored, which is nice to see. It's really interesting. Not much has changed. A lot of cottages on the island have not changed very much from 1880. A lot of cosmetic changes, but if you look closely, you can see the same cottage that was built in 1880, 1882. And the same is true of the old Sisters of Mercy property.
There were some questions and an answer, I think, from about whether there might be a plaque or dedication, and then we have Bill, who I'm going to guess is involved, who says a plaque, bench, and trail to the site are in the works. So that's for the edification of those who asked whether there'll be any commemoration of this on the conserved land.
Good. Well, that's good to know. I have some thoughts on the plaque, Bill.
And then there are questions or comments about whether Georgetown University might have letters between the brothers, and what relation of Bishop to Patrick Healy of Georgetown University, who was also born in Georgia. One of those seems more like a comment and one is a question. Are those two brothers?
They were brothers. I said
so
the Healy family was an amazing family. So
right.
One brother becomes Bishop of Portland. The other brother becomes, think about this for a second, becomes the president of Georgetown University. This is right after the Civil War. Washington is still, for all intents and purposes, a southern town. And again, it was known, his mixed race heritage was known as well. It's a pretty complicated story because Georgetown has been wrestling with its legacy of having owned slaves and having sold them for the benefit of the university. The Jesuits themselves owned large properties in Maryland and owned slaves and sold them. And Holy Cross has been struggling with the fact that one of the buildings on its campus, I think it's called Healy Hall, was built in part from donations by one of the Healy brothers, which were derived from the sale of slaves. So all those institutions have all been wrestling with how to deal with that heritage, but focusing simply on the two brothers, those were two, it was an extraordinary family. And again, all without the benefit of seeing their mother after they were sent north to school.
And one more question about Patrick Healy. The question was whether he also passed, or was he known publicly to be mixed race at that time when he was at Georgetown?
He was known within the Georgetown University community, certainly to be mixed race. I'm not sure that it was generally known beyond that, but I can't be absolutely certain. I am certain that there is an answer to anyone who's really interested in that question in the book that I referenced earlier, Passing for White, because it's an incredibly well-researched book.
And I'll mention, I dropped in the chat as well, but all three of the books you mentioned are available from the Portland Public Library. So if anyone is a card holder at the library and would like to check them out, you can go to portlandlibrary.com and look in our catalog and reserve them. We're doing pickup only right now, but you can set up a hold and check out those books.
I encourage people who are interested to read them. Start with Unworthy Republic, and you'll see how the state of Georgia was distributed to white landowners.
I think we've covered the questions in the chat. If anyone has any more, feel free to get them in quick before we decide to do something dramatic. And there are lots of people thanking you, Harry, in case you're not seeing that.
Well, I'll just thank you guys for hanging in with me. It's been longer than I would have thought.
All right. Jess, do you have...
I just would second or third or 20th what everybody's writing in the chat. Thank you, Harry, for your time and your energy on this project. It's super interesting. Sorry, I was distracted by chat. It's just a question as to whether the Sisters of Mercy might still have a photo or photos of their residents. and Bishop's Cottage.
The Sisters of Mercy, I think their archives are now, I believe, in South Carolina or North Carolina. It would be interesting at some point to see if I could get access there and just poke around, but that's a long ways away.
Yeah, in many ways, yes, it is. Yeah, so again, thank you so much. I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to share this space with all of you, and thankful to the library for hosting the Zoom. We had, over 50 people in attendance for this talk. That's pretty much, that's a really amazing thing about the talk and about Zoom. People are able to join us from where they are.
Well, that's great. I'll say one thing before I say goodbye, and that is I'm serious. If anybody else out there knows anything more about that cottage than I have told you, let me know. I'd love to hear. And on that note, thanks to all of you guys. I appreciate the time.
Thank you all. Our next event will be on February 24th, but of course, pay attention to the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative and their other events that don't happen to be partnerships with us, and our events too that aren't with them.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
So have a good night.